Growing Together, a gardening podcast, is sponsored by Bloomfield Garden Center, a family-owned retail greenhouse providing locally grown plants since 1974. You can find them 1 mile north of Sabin, Minnesota, or 6 miles south of I-94 at Exit 6. Just a quick drive from Fargo-Moorhead.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinzler, a lifelong gardener in the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Don, how you doing today?
Well, I am doing great, especially because we got a half an inch of rain in our yard
I know,
last night.
It's so nice to have a little bit of rain, and we hope that
it's been a long dry spell.
Yeah, we hope that it keeps coming. Well, before we get too far, we wanted to let you know that this podcast is sponsored by Bloomfield Garden Center, a family-owned retail greenhouse providing locally grown plants since 1974, and you can find them 1 mile south of Sabin, Minnesota, or 6 miles south of I-94 off Exit 6. Just a quick drive from Fargo-Moorhead. Hey, Don, did you hear about the gardener who went crazy?
No, I don't believe I did.
He was hearing voices in his shed.
I love it.
Well, we're not hearing voices, but we have heard from a lot of listeners with a lot of questions about what's happening in their garden and in their yards. So we're going to do our best, and by we, I mean Don, who is the expert here, is going to do his best to answer some of the most commonly asked questions.
Well, you know, it's fun to hear from listeners, and I want to just say how much we appreciate people listening. You know, and for those of you listening right this very instant, it's fun. You know, it's like you guys are on the phone, the other end of the phone with us. And I mean, even though we're doing kind of all the talking, it's like we're having a conversation with you listeners out there. And it's fun. It's like this gardening, for anybody listening, enjoying gardening. It's like kind of we're one big happy family. It's just fun to, like we're sitting around a table talking about gardening.
It is good because there's a common interest.
Yeah. So for anybody listening, we really appreciate our visits with you guys.
And you're really pulling for everybody because you want everybody to have a great garden, because especially if it's different from yours, then it gives you something else to look at,
and
something else to think about.
And like I always say, we're all in this together. You know, we have this similar struggles. You know, we all battle the weeds and deal with the weather. And so, we're all in this absolutely together.
So we'll bring this up at the end. But if people have questions for you, what's the best way to reach you?
Oh, to email me, donald.kinzler@ndsu.edu. And I love cell phones because you can snap some quick cell phone photos, email them on in, and we can carry on discussion that way too.
Well, we'll start with a question from a longtime listener, first-time caller, and that's me, Don. That's me. I'm going to take advantage of my place here. But what do we do with hornets and wasps and yellow jackets? We're not talking about bees. Bees are wonderful pollinators and they're our friends. We want to keep them. But hornets, wasps, and yellow jackets are really becoming a pest because it's been fairly dry, so we've been watering our yard and garden a lot. And then they come out and they want to be out there, but they can be a nuisance. What's the best way to treat and to get rid of hornets, wasps, and yellow jackets?
And it seems like they're always a nuisance kind of from midsummer onward. You know, not so much early, but at a certain point, midsummer onward, then they become a nuisance. You know, you try having a picnic in your backyard, and then they're buzzing around looking for your pop can.
And sit outside and just relax.
And now, it reminds me, at some point, we need to get the NDSU entomologists in and do a podcast. That'd be awesome. But anyway, when they start bothering us, the hornets and wasps and yellow jackets, one thing that's interesting to note is they do not do much pollinating, much if any. So our worker bees that do all the good things and give us strawberries and apples and cucumbers, they're a separate case. They aren't really aggressive the way these other insects are. And so getting rid of these that are annoying you, we aren't ruining our pollinators because they don't do pollination. And they are so aggressive. So things to try is if you can find where they're nesting, if there's a little spot. In our own home, we have a little gap in some outer trim, and they're nesting in those. And so if you can find a spot where they're nesting or congregating, and then if you get one of the wasp and hornet sprays, And I think the instructions usually say on the can to wait until evening when they're likely in that spot, and then use one of these sprays to spray into their opening, and of course then seal it up if you can. But there's usually a caution too: don't seal up those areas if those insects are still in there, because they'll find a way into your home. Because they're quite aggressive.
Yeah.
So we don't want to do that. So sealing that up, it comes with caution because they might all be in there and, et cetera. Traps can work. They aren't going to eliminate the huge volume of wasps and hornets are out there, but a trap might work, especially in the vicinity in which you're sitting.
Yeah, one of the things I read is that earlier in the spring and maybe the first part of summer, traps with some kind of a protein in them. That's what they're really attracted to, which is really strange to think. But they love hamburger.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's science behind that.
Yeah, and then they're in the second part of the summer, later in the summer and in the fall, to use something sweeter, but not a honey, because a honey will attract a bee.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so interesting. And, you can, of course, try those things, and they'll have some effect, but it's hard to totally eliminate because there are just so many in the atmosphere. Yeah.
So we're going to move on to some questions from some readers, or listeners, I should say. Let's start with some questions about trees and shrubs. And one thing that you've heard is a lot of maples are turning yellow, and a particular kind of yellow. People are asking what's causing this, and is it serious for a tree, and is there a treatment? To me, that sounds like chlorosis.
It does, yeah, and that's a mouthful, chlorosis. And a chlorosis means a yellowing of leaves. And when you drive around our towns, you can spot these yellow trees, maples. And my wife, Mary, as we're driving around, sometimes she'll say, gosh, that really looks showy. So these bright yellow trees against the deeper green of other types of trees can give a nice contrast. So if it was meant to be yellow, that'd be maybe kind of nice. But that yellow is, like you said, chlorosis, which is a yellowing of leaves. And unfortunately, it's not natural. And it shows that those trees are under stress. What happens with this chlorosis, yellowing, is that the leaves aren't manufacturing chlorophyll, the green pigment. And so then without that green pigment, the leaves are yellow. And without that green chlorophyll pigment, the leaves aren't doing their photosynthesis thing. So the tree is not healthy when it has that yellowing. And in most cases, that yellowing chlorosis is caused by the tree's inability to take up iron out of the soil. So it's called an iron chlorosis deficiency. And maples are very susceptible to this. Other trees, elm, green ash, hackberry, they'll just remain green right beside these affected maples. So the way to treat these trees is to visit the locally owned garden center, and they have iron products that you add. The instructions will say to either apply it to the leaves, which can give a quicker effect, but not as long-lasting. Or you can apply some products to the soil. It'll be taken up by the roots. That is slower to have an appearance effect, but it will be longer-lasting. So sometimes the two, spray the leaves with the type labeled for that, or also apply it to the root system for a longer effect. And it may take a while for that maple to green up. If it's left untreated, the maples will slowly go downhill. The yellow will turn to kind of a pale whitish, and they'll get a browning crispness around the leaves, and the tree can actually die. So it's serious. The quicker that you can treat your maple. Also, it needs to be done every year. So another question, will be too, should we be planting some of these maples? Maples would be happier in the naturally forested areas and soils of Minnesota and on east, where you kind of see the natural forests. Maples like that type of soil. From the Red River Valley on westward, our native prairie soil isn't as tailored to maples.
Isn't it interesting when you get out, because this is summer, you go out into the lakes area, boy, you hit that DL area, and you get past that, especially if you go north and east a little bit, you really get into maple country, and you see a lot more of it there than you do in the Red River Valley.
You do, and so there is a switch in soil type, from the Red River Valley on west, more of an alkaline soil. And yeah, maples really struggle.
Yeah, I know that because we have a maple tree. I think it was probably maybe even started as a volunteer, but it gets the yellowing leaves. So we've started doing that. I think it's what chelated iron.
Yeah, chelated iron.
CHLEA.
Yeah, it kind of looks like it would be pronounced chelated. But yeah, chelated is the pronunciation. And chelated iron, sold by garden centers, means that it's in a form more readily taken up by the tree.
Yeah, so we'll put in holes around kind of the drip line of the tree, so under the canopy of the tree, and then do it, as soon as you can in the spring, because then that's really when they're looking to take in some water, right? They're really
exactly.
They're the hungriest.
And so applying that in spring, like you say, John, when they're kind of taking up all this material with their active growth, that's the preferred time to treat. Now, I asked our forestry specialist, Joe Zalesnik, where this is showing up now, because, out of sight, out of mind, you don't sometimes think of these things until it's actually, you see it. But so now, since it's so visible, I asked him, in midsummer, can we still be applying these iron products? And he says, yes, absolutely. In June and July, go ahead and treat your maples, get some iron on it.
Well, that's good to know. I should do another round then.
Yeah, exactly. And the same maple situation leads us to the next question, and that's about autumn blaze maple. That is the one plant that I receive the most questions about, even more than tomatoes, is autumn blaze maple, because everybody would like a maple that has a bright red color in the fall. I mean, who wouldn't like that?
They are beautiful.
And so this autumn blaze maple is beautiful, but it doesn't like the soil of the Red River Valley and on westward for the reasons we mentioned. It would be happier eastward into Minnesota forested area. So it struggles in our soil. Now, the interesting thing about autumn blaze maple is that it's a roll of the dice. It will maybe do well, but one block away, it will struggle and have branch dieback and just eventually do nothing. So it's kind of like kids in the family. Some turn out really well. Some with the similar situation don't turn out so well. So autumn blaze maple is a roll of the dice. I always suggest don't plant it in an area that you want to depend on a tree. Choose some other, a more well-adapted species. But put it in a spot where if it does well, you'll have a nice tree. If not, you won't feel too bad about it.
Yeah, you can replace it.
Yeah, exactly. So, plant autumn blaze maple with caution.
With that, what are we looking for with autumn blaze maple? How do you know when they're in trouble, when they're not doing well?
You'll see the yellow chlorosis.
Okay.
That kind of sounds like cirrhosis, doesn't it? Yeah. So it's
also
kind
not
of
a good thing.
Cirrhosis of a maple, I guess, instead of other cirrhosis. So anyway, you'll know by the yellowing of the leaves, and also if you're getting branch dieback.
Okay. This kind of brings up an interesting thing too, which is that, we've talked about this before, that when you're going out and you're buying a new plant or buying a tree, really make sure that it's good for our zone, which is one thing, and that's weather, right? Yeah. But really, there are some things where you really should make sure that the soil is right too.
You bring up the good point too, that a tree that's adapted, or any shrub perennial, a tree that's adapted, it isn't just about winter cold hardiness. It's also about soil type. And maple is a great example that it may be winter hardy enough because these trees growing in northern Minnesota, they're winter hardy enough, but it's the soil adaptation. So good point.
Well, I hate to make this a whole maple thing, but can you treat your soil if you really want a maple? Let's say you want a maple in your backyard or your yard or whatever. Can you put something in there to make the soil more alkaline?
That's a good question, because where our soils are already quite alkaline already from the Red River Valley on west, why not just add something to acidify the soil to make it more like eastern Minnesota acid type soils? And so you can add sulfur and different things, but trying to acidify the big mass of soil that a tree roots are growing in, it's kind of like trying to change the color of the ocean by adding food coloring. There's just too big. It might work for a year, but then it won't. So changing the acidity of a tree's soil is too great of a task.
One more question about maples from a listener. So our maple has red bumps on the underside of the leaves. Is this a disease or an insect? And what should I do?
Very common, the underside, and you'll know them when you see them. The underside of a maple oftentimes get these bumps, greenish, reddish, and they're galls, maple leaf gall. And the good news is that they don't really hurt the tree. The trees live with it fine, so it's cosmetic. We get more concerned about it than the tree is. They're caused by a little mite that starts feeding as soon as the leaves expand in spring, and the mite encases itself inside this tissue, and there's no treatment when you see the bumps. The mite is inside, and no amount of spray is going to get to that little mite. If you do want to control them, it's horticultural oil applied to the trunk in early spring, just as the buds are breaking. But usually none of us are thinking about that. But good news is you don't really need to do anything about it. The tree isn't concerned about it.
Another tree question is someone who'd like to prune the lower branches on the boulevard tree. The tree was planted 5 years ago, but the lower branches hit me in the face when I mow. Can I prune them now?
You can, yep. And if you need to limb up branches of a young tree, do that before the branch gets an inch in diameter. If you let it go too long, you'll have too big of a wound. But don't remove those branches too young, because those lower branches do feed the trunk. They feed the entire tree, so you'll get a better rate of growth if those lower branches are left in place. But eventually, if they're going to be too low, then remove them before they get to be 1 inch diameter.
From another listener, I planted a new tree this spring. Is the heat... in this heat, how often should I be watering? So, because we've dealt with a number of, we've already almost matched our 90-degree days from last year. So we've been dealing with a hot streak here just this mid-June. What should people be doing for watering on hot days?
Sometimes we're so concerned that a tree is going to die from lack of water that it's common to overwater. So young trees do not need to be watered every day. That keeps it too wet. We need oxygen down into the soil. So as a rule of thumb, before you do any watering, scrape away a little of the soil. See if it's moist enough, don't water. But if it's dry, giving it a good deep soak, and when I say a good deep soak, a newly planted tree, maybe 2 5-gallon buckets of water slowly poured on at least, so 10 gallons, and once or twice a week should be sufficient, even in the heat. So maybe twice a week when it's really hot.
When we got a new boulevard tree, our neighbor came over and he had a thing called a gator.
Yes.
And it's basically a plastic, or it's a bladder basically.
Yeah, a tree bag.
Yeah.
Put around the trunk.
And you fill it with water, and it has little emitters, basically little holes that slowly release the water. So you're not flooding the area.
They work great. I think they hold between 10, depending on the bag, 10 to 15 gallons, which slowly percolates down. They're a great way to water a tree.
Yeah,
but again, once or twice a week is plenty with that.
But especially
they're great.
If you plan on having, a new tree this year, a new tree next year, a good investment to make in getting something like that. This is a particular one. We've talked about maples, but this is an Ohio buckeye. Ohio buckeye that we planted several years ago. The edges of the leaves are brown and crisp. We've been watering faithfully. Does it have a disease?
Well, the good news is it does not have a disease. Now, despite the name Ohio, Ohio buckeye is actually a really good tree for our area. There's a good one developed at NDSU called Prairie Torch, Ohio buckeye. Beautiful fall color. So a good alternative to a maple. And Ohio buckeye, though, when we have extended heat, is susceptible to what's called leaf scorch, and other trees can get this too. Even if the soil is moist enough, on hot, windy days, the leaves lose moisture quicker than the roots can pump it up to the leaf, and so they develop a crispness around the edge. So extended heat and wind can cause that, but there's not a whole lot we can do about it because the soil might be moist enough.
All right, we're going to take a quick little break, and when we come back, we're going to answer some questions that people have about lawns.
Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month. You'll get unlimited access to the news you need to stay engaged and connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe now to get 3 months of local news for only 99 cents a month.
Okay, we're back and we're taking some common questions that Don has often been asked, and he's going to give his answer to some of these. We're going to talk about lawns for a little bit. One question is, my lawn is very lumpy and it's even hard to walk across. What causes this and what can I do?
Every time I hear that, immediately I think night crawlers.
Okay.
Because night crawlers, of course, they're beneficial. They kind of tunnel through the lawn and soil surface. They're doing good things. But they cause these mounding. You don't necessarily see them, but walking across a lawn affected by night crawlers is like walking across golf balls. And that's quite an image to me. And if you've walked across it, for anybody listening to this, oh, wow, yeah, immediately that brings to mind. Yeah, exactly. And so it can actually feel like you're going to turn an ankle.
Ooh.
And so it's night crawlers. There are no products, chemicals that are labeled for controlling night crawlers because they're a beneficial species. And so, there's no product you can use to spray on. So what you do to mitigate that is power rake. About once or twice a year, power rake, that will level out the bumps. Also, if you're watering the lawn, instead of frequent shallow waterings, which will keep the night crawlers close to the surface, instead water deeply, which is better for the lawn too. Water less often and deeper, and the night crawlers will tend to go deeper into the soil following that moisture. But no chemical products can be used. But on the good side, they're doing good things for your lawn.
Yeah. Well, this is a particularly timely question, but with all the tree seeds that dropped a month ago, many are sprouting in my lawn, and I have little tree seedlings all over. I've tried pulling them up by hand, but there are too many. Is there something else I can do? This is something I've even seen in our yard, and you have to get down to
In my case, it's Siberian elm, and they have no dormancy. So as soon as the seed drops, if the moisture is right, it'll sprout, and it doesn't care where it's sprouting.
Yeah.
It'll be in my peonies and iris and also in the lawn. So what can you do in the lawn? Well, luckily, there are some lawn herbicides that will handle this. And look for the active ingredient triclopyr, T as in Tom, triclopyr. That'll be on the front of the label down in fine print under the active ingredients, triclopyr. There are a number of different brands that will handle that. And so triclopyr will not kill the lawn grass. It's a lawn herbicide. But it's quite effective on little tree seedlings and other hard to kill weeds. Might not do it all in one application, so you might need to reapply.
Okay. Another one, when I walk across my lawn, my shoes are covered by a rust-colored dust. When I mow the mower is covered with this dust. What is this and what can I do?
And we see this about this time, from midsummer maybe on. Have you ever experienced that, John, on your lawn?
Yeah.
And sometimes you mow the lawn, and so you got all this red dust over it, and your shoes will be covered. And it's rust colored, and actually that's what it is a rust, which is a fungus. The good news is that it doesn't really harm the lawn. So it seems like it's part of the heat and humidity that gets this fungus going, but it doesn't really harm the lawn. But it's still annoying. And so what can we do about it? Well, there's been shown a factor that makes the rust worse, and that's if the lawn is low in nitrogen. So fertilizing in the spring can help the lawn to be healthier around Memorial Day, and you're having less chance of rust than in midsummer. But also fertilizing in September. That may sound like, well, that's after the rust. Well, yeah, but fertilizing in September will make the lawn healthier for next spring. And next summer, then less likely to get the rust. But it's an annoyance, and it won't last the whole summer. So kind of put up with it for, the week or two that it's around, and wash your mower off, wash your shoes off, and it won't harm the lawn that much.
And then just get ready to fertilize in the fall and then again in the spring.
Yep, because a lawn that's higher in nitrogen, well nutrition, then has less chance of getting it.
So when it's been so dry, we've all been watering a bit more. And this person asks, I've got a sprinkler system and have been watering my lawn. There are mushrooms popping up. What can I do to get rid of them?
Well, the good news, another piece of good news about this is that the mushrooms don't really harm the lawn. The mushrooms are growing on organic matter that's below soil surface. Now, that could be an old tree stump or an old 2x4 that was left after construction, or maybe they're just decomposing the thatch layer. And so the mushroom that you see is actually just the fruiting body of the fungus. The main system is a root-like mass called mycelium underneath. And it doesn't really harm the lawn at all. It's just decomposing organic matter. And in turn, it releases nutrients into the soil. So these mushroom and fungi are an important part of nature. They break down organic material. And so just rake off what you see and dispose of it. And can you eat those? That's a common question, but it's interesting. Another question I'm often asked is someone will send a picture of a mushroom and say, is this edible? But what we like to say in horticulture is mushrooms and fungi are in a total different kingdom. There's the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, and a separate kingdom is fungi. And so identifying fungi, mushrooms as to whether they're edible, we can't do that because there's too much chance of something going wrong and somebody eating something that they shouldn't do. So generally, don't eat mushrooms off of the lawn. And so just rake them off. There are no treatments that will keep them from coming back. But usually it's just a certain time of summer that they'll pop up and appear, rake them off, and they'll usually disappear.
We find them in spots of the yard where we use mulch to kind of cover some ground area. If it's an area that doesn't get a lot of traffic and it is moist and kind of shady, we'll see some pop up, like tiny little ones. They're easy to pick up and then discard. Yeah,
and you mentioned kind of a shady, moist areas. One thing you can do is to, like with a spading fork, you can poke holes into the area. That'll get a little more air down in, and the mushrooms might decompose that organic matter a little quicker, and then when they're done with their decomposition, they tend to disappear and won't come back yearly.
Well, flowers are really coming in right now. It's a great time for gardens, and so we'll get into some questions about that. How important is it to cut off the dead flowers on peonies and iris?
Yeah, because they're pretty much done blooming now. I still have a few iris later ones that are blooming, but the peonies are pretty well done. And then they form that kind of seed pod up on top. And those seed pods, whether it's peonies, iris, or really any perennial, that seed pod that forms after the flowers are done does drain energy from the plant. And there's really no reason to leave that seed pod on. We don't want these things to seed themselves. And because it's an energy drain, it is important to cut those off, called deadheading a perennial. And so, yes, as soon as the flowers fade, I like to go ahead and just prune off the seed pod that's starting to form on peonies or iris. So it is important to take them off.
You said you don't want them to self-seed. Why not? Why wouldn't that mean you get more peonies? Or are you talking about in an area where you've already got things kind of constructed the way you?
Yeah, you've already got things kind of in place. And like peonies, wouldn't it be kind of fun if they actually did seed themselves and have some new peonies? But some of the things like peonies don't come up really easy from their own seed. Same with iris. And so as a rule, any seedlings that might come up aren't worth the depressive effect that seed pod would have on the peonies. It can sap some strength.
Another question about deadheading. Our geraniums look bad when the flowers fade, leaving the dead blooms. Can I just cut off the dead flowers with the scissors?
Geraniums are one of the container plants that really respond well to removing the old blossom. Again, they start to form a seed head that can be a drain, and if you keep that spent flower off as they form, it encourages more bloom to happen. So it's interesting on geraniums. If you just kind of cut off that dead flower, the flower stalk on which that is, the remaining flower stalk will tend to die and leave a spot where disease could enter. So on geraniums, okay, you've got the dead flower and the dead flower stalk on which it was, then just move your hand to the base of that flower stalk where it joins the stem and just kind of bend the flower stalk off, and it snaps off.
Okay.
So try it. You'll know exactly what Kinzler meant. So instead of cutting it, leave your scissors on the shelf and just by hand snap off that dead flower stalk. And also, since they can kind of carry some rotting type disease, carry along a 5-gallon bucket. In fact, really, when you're deadheading most of these things, you carry along a 5-gallon bucket and drop them in that rather than putting them down on the ground. Because even like peonies are susceptible to different mildews and things, so just kind of getting rid of that litter does help.
So when you're talking about this, the technique of kind of going down, finding to where it goes to the stalk and bending it back, so that's different than pinching, right? When you pinch off, let's say you pinch off something like coleus or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, pinching the seed stalk off of coleus. Yeah. And geraniums are kind of unique in that they have that flower stalk that just kind of snaps off by itself. But like coleus doesn't have that. And for example, on petunias. Petunias can be quite a job to, if you had a whole flower bed full of petunias, it's a kind of a job to deadhead. But if you have them in a container or a hang basket, then you can easily kind of deadhead, take off those spent blossoms. Now, interesting on petunia, and I'm asked this fairly often, do you just kind of pull off the withered blossoms? But no, what you're going after is the seed pod that starts to enlarge. So just pulling off the withered blossoms isn't enough. You need to pinch off, and that's a good term that you brought up, John, pinch off below those withered blossoms. You need to pinch off that developing seed pod that is starting to enlarge. And as soon as you look at a petunia close, it's like, oh, sure, now I see what I mean. There's that enlargement there that we need to remove because that's a seed pod.
So speaking of petunias, they're a plant that definitely does well with fertilizer. Someone asked, how often should I fertilize our container plantings?
And containers, plants, as a rule, are heavy feeders. Those annual flowers need to do a lot of work during the course of the season because, of course, an annual flower's goal in life is to produce seed during its one season. It only lives for one growing season, so it wants to produce seed and reproduce itself. And so that's why deadheading is so important. If we can keep those seed heads from forming, it'll keep producing longer. But because it keeps producing longer, it needs a lot of nutrition. So fertilizing once a week, every 10 days, is great with water-soluble types. We don't endorse particular products, but the Miracle-Gro water-soluble fertilizer is certainly the widest available.
You can see that in bigger garden centers too.
Exactly.
So.
It works really, really well. And a common question is, okay, if I used potting mix that says it has fertilizer in it, that feeds for 6 months, do I also need to apply some of the fertilizer? The water-soluble type. And yes, you certainly can. Because these plants feed so heavily, even if your potting mix had fertilizer in it, those little kind of beads that you see in the mix, go ahead and supplement that with water-soluble fertilizer every, week or 10 days.
All right. We're going to take another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk vegetable gardens and fruit trees.
If you're loving this podcast, be sure to check out our full lineup. From news and local politics to sports and true crime, find your next great listen right now at inforum.com/podcasts. That's inforum.com/podcasts.
We're back and we're answering some of listeners' most asked questions to Don. And when I say we're answering, I mean Don is answering. I'll be the surrogate questioner, and Don will answer the questions. And we're going to talk about vegetable gardens. One of the questions asked is, my cucumbers have lots of blossoms, but there aren't any cucumbers forming. What's wrong?
And sometimes we think, okay, and we get excited when we see the cucumbers blossoming. We think, oh, good, I'm gonna have some cucumbers really, really soon. But it's fun. Cucumbers and squash and pumpkin are the same family, and there are 2 types of blossoms on those plants: cucumbers, melons, pumpkins, squash. 2 types. They're both male and female flowers on those. Well, how do you tell the difference? Well, the colored part of the blossom looks the same, the yellow. But if you look at the base of that flower, the female flowers have like a little miniature cucumber right at the base of it, or a pumpkin has a little miniature pumpkin right at the base of that yellow. The male flowers don't have that. So when cucumbers or squash pumpkin first start blossoming, most of the blossoms are the male blossoms, okay, without the little cucumber at the base. So check under the blossom and see. After that first flush of male blossoms, the female blossoms will start to be formed. And that's when you get the cross-pollination and you'll start getting little cucumbers. So it's not unusual for the first flush of blossoms not to result in cucumbers. Eventually, they'll start producing the female blossoms and then you'll start getting little cucumbers.
Okay, another popular vegetable, and I'm sure this is a question you get a lot. Our tomatoes always have the dry rot on the bottom of the tomato fruits. What can I do to prevent this? Is this the same as blossom end rot?
Blossom end rot, yeah, okay. Exactly. And the good news is it's not a disease as such, so we can't spray for it to prevent this disease. Instead, it's related to calcium. The tomato plant can't take up calcium out of the soil, and so it sucks the calcium out of the developing fruit, causing that black, sunken base. Well, our soils have plenty of calcium, so it doesn't work to add more calcium. Sometimes you see on Facebook people adding Tums, because Tums is calcium. And no, our soils have plenty of calcium, so adding more Tums, etc. Epsom salt is a no-no. But the problem is the tomato plant can't use that calcium that's in the soil. That calcium needs to be in a liquid form that the roots can take up. So in a liquid form is related to soil moisture. And of course, the calcium in the soil has to be in a liquefied form in order for the roots to take it up. And so in the liquefied form, that means that the soil has to be moist enough. And in our area, we get this fluctuating moisture. We get rain, then it's dry, then we get rain, or if you water, and then it dries out. And that fluctuating soil moisture causes the roots not to be able to take up this calcium. So the way to prevent blossom end rot is to keep the soil moisture uniformly moist. And then that calcium that's in the soil naturally will be in a soluble form that the roots can drink it on up. So a couple things we can do is just watch the watering and don't let the tomato plants dry out excessively in between. But the best way is to just mulch around the tomato plants. That will keep the soil more uniformly moist, and the roots then will have the calcium in a kind of a water solution that they can drink on up. Mulches that can be used, could use straw. If it hasn't been treated with herbicides, sometimes that can be a problem. Lawn clippings that have not been treated with herbicide, that makes a good ready mulch as well.
When you're talking about the soil in our area having a lot of calcium, what if you're putting the tomatoes in a pot? If you're using them in a container, same thing, or like if you're using
That's a good question.
A potting soil, do you want to look for something with more calcium, or are there calcium additives?
Yeah, that's a good question because the potting mixes are much different, of course, than our native soils that have enough calcium already. But generally, the potting mixes have been analyzed to have enough calcium in. So the main thing, too, with a container-grown tomato is keep the soil moisture uniform because it's easy for a potted tomato to let them dry out a lot in between waterings.
Yeah.
And so really be cautious with keeping the soil evenly moist in a potted tomato.
I never heard about that, but the mulching, around a tomato, that does make sense as a way to kind of maintain that moisture and keep a kind of an even keel there.
Yep, exactly.
So somebody said, along with tomatoes, peppers. I planted sweet bell peppers next to my hot jalapeno peppers. Now someone told me that's going to make the bell peppers taste hot instead of sweet. Is that true?
Yeah, it's not true, but it's kind of an interesting concept. You think, gosh, well, are the two, okay, the bees are, or wind, peppers are mostly wind pollinated. But anyway, are they going to like cross-pollinate and affect the fruit? And no, any possible effect that the two peppers planted side by side would be in the seed that would form inside the fruit. It has no effect on the developing fruit. Sometimes you get similar question on like cucumbers and melons. Would if you're growing muskmelon beside cucumbers, will they cross? And will that make my muskmelon taste kind of like a cucumber, kind of flat-like? And the answer again is no. Even if they were able to cross, it affects the seed inside and not the developing fruit.
We're coming up at the end of rhubarb season. Somebody asked, our rhubarb plants are sending up big seed stalks. I cut them out, but they keep coming. Can I just let them go?
It's better to remove them because the seed stalk that it forms is an energy drain. So similar to deadheading the peonies and iris and things like that, it's better to remove that big flower stalk that would eventually form seed on the rhubarb. And so that's an energy drain. And so now rhubarb, when you harvest the stalks of rhubarb, usually it's recommended you don't cut them, but instead pull the rhubarb off. But those big stalks, you can try pulling, but sometimes they're so tough, you might need to use a pruner or a big scissors to cut those off. But do try to get that off.
Now, with those, again, is that something that you want to discard that spent seed stalk after you cut that off? Or will it help seed more rhubarb?
Well, that's a good question, but rhubarb doesn't usually seed itself naturally, so I don't think it's going to work very well. So I'd just remove it and dispose of it.
And I said the end of the rhubarb season is coming. I was always told that you want to pretty much, you have up until July is as a rule of thumb to get your rhubarb in. After that, it doesn't grow as much and it's not as good. Is that true, or is that just kind of an old wives' tale?
No, that is very much true. Yeah, the wisdom of old gardeners. Of course, and horticulture professor Neil Holland, who taught me and so many of us so much, said that July 4th is Independence Day for gardeners because there are certain things you stop doing or you no longer have to do. And one of those is you stop the harvest of rhubarb and also asparagus. And so July 4th, you stop the harvest of rhubarb. The reason for that is rhubarb is very generous to us. It lets us pluck off all its stems and leaves, for the first half of the growing season. But the last half of the growing season, July 4th on, it needs to have those stalks and leaves to replenish itself and build up energy down in the roots again. And so we return the favor on rhubarb by letting it have its leaves and everything for the last part of the growing season. At the end of the summer, you can do a little light harvest, but generally stop July 4th.
So from the vegetable garden to fruit trees, we've got some questions about fruit trees. We get lots of apples from our apple tree, but they always have brown streaks inside. What is this, and how can we prevent it?
The brown streaks are one of the most common problems of apples in our area, and it's caused by the apple maggot, which is an adult fly that lays its eggs on developing fruit. The eggs hatch into a little larvae that goes into the fruit and works internally, and then in the fall of the year, when you cut open your apple, it has all these brown streaks. The larvae, the maggot, has already exited, but you see all this streaking. So the way to prevent that is to begin spraying. You could use a home orchard spray that has an insecticide in it, or the insecticide spinosad or 8 is another good insecticide. So check the label and follow that carefully. But begin spraying usually about the end of June here. And you do need to spray every 7 to 10 days, but even a couple of sprays throughout the growing season will help diminish them.
Okay. Another apple question. Our apple tree gets a heavy fruit crop every other year. Is that normal?
That's quite common on apple trees, called biennial bearing, where they'll produce a really, really heavy crop of fruit. And it's almost like that takes so much energy for the apple tree that then they rest for another year. And that does make some sense because that's what happens with the tree. But you can break that habit by thinning the apple crop. So if this is a really, really heavy apple year, thin the apples. So when they're about dime-sized, just go ahead by hand and pull off the excess fruit so that they're spaced about 4 to 6 inches apart, because apples tend to form little clusters. So go ahead and take off everything, leaving them spaced 4 to 6 inches apart. What that will do is give you a nice crop of apples this year, but it will conserve some of that energy in the apple tree. It won't lose all its stuff this year. And so next year you'll have a crop. So you break that habit by thinning the apples during a boom type year.
Now, I also heard apricots are often every other year too, right?
They are. Sometimes that's the case. They bloom so very, very early that sometimes they get frosted. But yeah, if it's a heavy crop, then do the same type of thinning. It's interesting too. It seems like, oh gosh, it's such a waste to take off some of those young little apples, but the remaining apples will be larger and a better quality. Sweeter, redder, etc., because all the energy of the tree is going into less apples. But you'll still get a very good crop, but just not that boom or bust. Oh, also important is during those boom years when you get that tremendous heavy crop, that's when apple branches tend to break.
Yeah.
So thinning the apples can also be really, really important for the tree's structure.
Yeah, sometimes I had a friend who had a big apple tree, and it would you could really see it under the stress of it.
And people try to put a 2x4 under a branch to support them up. And so, yeah, thinning is, the commercial orchards do thinning all the time.
Another apple question. We planted an apple tree about 4 years ago, but no apples. Is there something wrong?
Oh, and we all get impatient. But the average bearing time for an apple tree is 5 to 7 years. The commercial orchards, and of course they're all about producing good fruit crop. Commercial orchards will remove all the fruit of a young apple tree for at least the first 3 or 4 years. So they'll just, as they're starting to form, they'll go ahead and remove all the little developing fruit, and that lets the energy go into the structure of the tree. So if we can be a little patient, those early apples should be removed if they start forming. And as a rule, 5 to 7 years is the length we need to wait until the apple tree will start bearing. Some varieties will start a little earlier, but again, don't expect fruit until 4 or 5 years. Some types, like Haralson, can take 7 to 9 years. So gardening teaches us patience.
And it's really an investment. The investment really is in time, and just being able to allow that time.
Yeah, it is. Yep. So if we can just, I battle the same thing. Sometimes you're so anxious to taste those apples. But yeah, if you can, remove them, and the tree will be better in the long run.
Well, we're going to wind down with a question. I have never heard this before. So this is an interesting one. I'm sure it'll be interesting to some listeners too. So the question is, I've heard you can get an apple tree to produce fruit if you hit the trunk with a chain. That stressing the tree will make it start fruiting. Is that true?
It's not true. That's an old wives' tale, and I don't pick on old wives because some of the best gardeners I've ever known have been old wives.
Absolutely.
So call it an old wives' or an old husband's tale. I hear more husbands say this one. But yeah, the idea of beating an apple tree to stress it, to get it to produce fruit. Yeah, no, totally wrong, totally potentially damaging.
Yeah.
And so, no, okay. The rationale behind some of that is that if a tree is under stress, it will have the instinct to reproduce. And sometimes that happens when a tree is under stress. But we don't want to do that to an apple tree because maybe it'll bear this year and then die next. And so, no, keep your apple tree healthy. One thing you can do that can delay fruiting beyond the 5 years or so is avoid fertilizing the lawn in an area around the apple tree. Lawn fertilizer is heavy in nitrogen, which keeps leafy growth. And if you fertilize too much lawn around the apple tree, that can keep the apple tree growing with lots of leaves at the expense of fruit. So stay away from the apple tree with lawn fertilizer, at least the height of the apple tree outward. If you laid the apple tree kind of on its side, the roots are at least out that far, probably more. It might mean the lawn isn't quite as lush around your apple tree, but that's okay. It'll be better for the apple tree. So yeah, don't hit your apple tree.
No, don't beat the tree.
We need to be kind to our apple trees.
Well, Don, this has been a lot of fun. It's always great to hear the questions that people have, and because a lot of these are relatable, even if even I don't have an apple tree, it's interesting to hear. So thanks a lot for taking the time to answer a lot of these listener questions.
Oh yeah, and I love these. It's like a round table with all of our gardeners and our listeners.
And so if people have questions, what's the best way to reach you?
To email me, Donald.Kinzler. Let me spell that. Kinzler, Donald.Kinzler at ndsu.edu. Occasionally I get a little behind, so be patient with me and I will get your question answered.
And if they have a picture, they can send that along too. That's
that's always great. Yeah. Photo is worth, 1,000 words.
Well, thanks again, and we will talk to you next week.
Great. Thanks much.
Growing Together, a gardening podcast, is sponsored by Bloomfield Garden Center, a family-owned retail greenhouse providing locally grown plants since 1974. You can find them 1 mile north of Sabin, Minnesota, or 6 miles south of I-94 at exit 6. Just a quick drive from Fargo-Moorhead.